Hi, I'm Steve Brown. I'm a historian who has a disability. I've been involved in disability rights and disability rights organizations for most of my adult life since the early 1980s. I'm also the co-founder with my wife, Lillian Gonzalez Brown, of the Institute on Disability Culture, and I'm a retired professor of disability studies from the University of Hawaii. So I'm going to talk about why I got involved in disability rights and how that connects to the ADA. So in 1981, I graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a doctorate in history. And probably nobody who's listening to this, or very few people, will remember that time, and even fewer will know that there were very few jobs in the social sciences and history at that time. In my particular field, I think there were 3 or 4 jobs in the country. And so chances are somebody from the University of Oklahoma wasn't going to get one of those. And my department, my university recognized that. So they were hiring one graduate with a doctorate each year. This was the second year they did that, to hire us for a 1-year lectureship. And hopefully during that year, we would find a job. So I was teaching freshman history classes, several hundred people at a time. And in one of my first classes in the fall of the first semester I was doing that, 2 students came up to me. One had a visual impairment and one was blind. And they asked me if they could tape my lectures because I talked really fast. And I said, sure, I had no problem with that. But I also said, trying to connect with them a little more, that I used a cane. And so we talked a little bit about, why I would do that. And I've had a disability, a mobility disability and chronic pain since I was 5. And that's a much longer detailed explanation, but that's the short one. So, so I was using a cane in those days, and we talked a little bit. And as it turned out, they were both involved with the first independent living center in Oklahoma, which was in Norman, where the university was. Independent living centers, which are grassroots disability rights organizations. And they asked me if I'd be interested in attending a meeting and maybe volunteering. So I really didn't want to go to another meeting. That was not a thing I liked to do in my life at that time. But because I wanted to keep connecting with them, I said, sure, I'll do that. So I went to this meeting, and the Independent Living Project is what it was called in those days, was planning for a statewide disability rights conference. And they were doing things like, the one thing I really remember is they were doing a workshop on sexuality and disability. And then they were bringing in these 2 national leaders, neither of whom I had heard of till then. One was a guy named Frank Bowe, who unfortunately is no longer with us, but who wrote a number of books and did a lot of other things. And he actually wrote one of the first books that I read about disability rights, which was Handicapping America. And then the other person that they brought in, who probably needs no introduction, and I know you've interviewed her, and that's Judy Heumann. So I began to get involved with this organization. I started doing a little volunteering. And then my year passed. I still didn't have a job. I didn't know what I was going to do. And then I was sitting at home one day, had a young daughter, and my department chair called and said there was a company in Tulsa that was looking for someone to write a history of their company. Would I be interested? And, it had nothing to do with my field, my passion, but it did have to do with having a job. So I said, sure. And I talked to this guy at this company, and he liked my credentials. He didn't, I should say, I didn't have very much experience in writing a proposal. So he helped me with that, especially with the budget. And verbally, I was hired. And now this was long enough ago that you used to be able to go into airports, no security. So he was flying one day from Tulsa to Dallas, and he had a layover in Oklahoma City, and so, which is very close to Norman, where I was. And so I agreed to meet him for lunch. And I told them I'd be easy to recognize. I was about 6'4", which I was in those days, had a beard, much less gray in it in those days, actually no gray, and I used crutches. And so he heard crutches and the conversation totally changed. He asked me what was wrong. This is 1982, and I had no problem talking about it. So we had this conversation. We agreed to meet for lunch the day he was at the airport. I went. I was really nervous. It was a terrible interview. But at the end of it, he said that they'd call me to come up to Tulsa to their office the next week and sign a contract. And then I never heard from them. So I called, and we had about a 45-minute conversation in which the only two things at this stage of the game I remember are when he told me that he didn't think somebody who used crutches could write a book. And I was 6'4" and about 160 pounds, so I was really skinny. And Oklahoma, as some people know, is a big college football state. And so he said, well, maybe if you had the physique of a football player, you'd have the stamina to do this, but we don't think you do. So I hung up the phone. Actually, I slammed down the phone, got in my car, drove to the Independent Living Project, started ranting and raving about what could I do. And they said nothing. And then I talked to an attorney in a statewide disability advocacy office. Same thing. I went to a lawyer, same thing. Finally, I got to the Oklahoma Human Rights Commission, and I asked them, well, I didn't ask them, I filed a complaint with them. And after 6 months or so, the time they had to respond to a complaint, I got the response, which was that yes, I had been discriminated against. Yes, it was because of my disability, but there was nothing they could do because it wasn't illegal. So that's my first awareness of being discriminated against. It's a very, very specific experience in my life, but hardly unique, especially at that time for people with disabilities who are looking for work. And then I started, because I didn't have a job and I didn't know what I was going to do, I started volunteering every day at the Independent Living Project. That fall, they had 2 new positions funded. One was doing peer support, consumer skills training, and community organizational development. And I applied and got that one. So then I started working at the Independent Living Project. And I still tell this story about this experience because even with the ADA, this could still happen. This company had fewer than 15 employees. They had no federal funding. So, they could still do it. But I think a big difference now is that that lawyer I went to might have reacted differently. And there's a different atmosphere about how people with disabilities are treated in that kind of scenario. There's also plenty of the same kind of treatment, but it's not always that case, which it pretty much was in those days. So I worked throughout the 80s at various disability rights organizations, well, 2 disability rights organizations. In the late 80s, I was the director of this Independent Living Project, which now was an independent living center called Progressive Independence. And so I did things like educate about ADA. And I clearly remember the day that the ADA was signed. I was invited to go, but I didn't. And the reason I didn't was because I had a prior commitment. I had a meeting scheduled in where was it? In Austin. And my feeling about it was the ADA was passed so people could do things like this, could lead their typical lives. And so that's what I chose to do. Now, in retrospect, I don't know if that was the right decision, but that was the reasoning, and that's why I did it. The first time I knew that ADA had an impact was actually fairly early on. I had moved from Oklahoma to California. I was working at the World Institute on Disability in the Bay Area in Oakland at that point. And I had met Lillian, who became my wife, and I had a daughter from a previous marriage, and she had come out to live with us, and so she was for a while, and so she was going to school. She was going to a private school, and they were putting on a play. And this school was pretty good. It had, from an access standpoint, it had accessible um, areas to it and inaccessible ones, both to somebody using a wheelchair, which I was at that point. And so they were putting on a play, and my daughter was going to be in the play, and they were putting it in an inaccessible place. So we went, I think we both went, to meet with them about, it might have been about something else, but that came up. And I told them that they needed to move the play to a place where we could attend it. And I said there was this new law. This was probably 92. So I said that there was this new law that required public places to be accessible to people who use wheelchairs and who needed accessibility. And they did. So that was the first impact I was really clearly aware of with ADA in my own personal life. Since then, I've been in a number of different countries. I've traveled a lot throughout the US, and I have both probably good stories and bad stories, or maybe a better way of putting it is highs and lows in relation to the impact of ADA. And one of the highs is probably most architectural access, with one big exception. And you know, I live in a place now where there's curb cuts on almost every sidewalk that is near me, although there are places without sidewalks, and that's a whole different story. I can get into most buildings, and if I can't get into a building, it really makes me mad because I know I ought to be able to. The one exception is there's still very few really accessible bathrooms. Even the ones that are called accessible are actually, I don't think, really accessible. Meaning, in a lot of times you can get a chair in a stall if you're using a stall as a male, if you're using a stall, but you usually can't turn around in them. So that's one example of kind of the up and down of the impact ADA has had. But what I will say is that pretty much every time I've met someone from another country, they're amazed at the access that we have in the cities, especially. My biggest frustration with ADA from the very beginning, and it continues, and it's not just ADA, it's this country as a whole, and it's not just this country, and that's the employment situation. When I started work in the early 80s at the Independent Living Project, the unemployment and underemployment rate for people with disabilities was about 70%. And today, almost 40 years later, it's still about 70%. So that's my biggest frustration. I've been saying for a while now, at least for 10 years, probably longer than that, that the biggest thing I think people with disabilities need is to be treated with dignity. And, you know, I'll broaden that. I won't say only people with disabilities. I think every individual needs to be treated with dignity. And there's a lot of lack, for better way of putting it, a lot of lack of that in this country and in this world, but especially in this country, which we're seeing all over the place right now, that people aren't being treated with dignity and respect. And, you know, it's not that everybody wants the same things. I mean, there's millions of people with disabilities. Why would we all want the same things? We don't. So if we're treated with dignity and respect, and people ask us both individually and as a group what it is that we want, or how can we access what we want, it would be a lot easier, I think, well, easier might not be the right word. It would be a lot better for doing things like getting employment. And, I focused on employment in a few minutes ago, but employment is not in and of itself, by itself. It's employment, transportation, insurance, housing. Housing is one of my huge frustrations because um, there is such a lack of accessible housing. When we lived in Hawaii for 12 years, and we knew one person that had a mostly accessible house and another person who had a ramp that they used so that we could get into their house. And that was it. And that was in Honolulu. So, or on Honolulu, it wasn't, so it was the major metro center with a lot of people. In California, in the Bay Area, where, people think of it as one of the most accessible places, and in some ways it is, but still there's very few houses that are accessible, and certainly very few that are completely accessible. So as an individual who lives in a community, I think one thing we can do to be aware of how to improve the lives of people with disabilities is, first of all, since we're talking about the ADA, to enforce the ADA. When there's a place that needs architectural accessibility, let's get it there. When there's transportation, if it's not accessible, let's figure out a way to do that. Everyone needs health insurance of some kind. Let's get that, and not fight about it. Let's just do it. Um, and from a more individual perspective, um, if we see something that isn't working, whoever that we is, if we see a sidewalk that doesn't have a curb cut, an area of a street that doesn't have a sidewalk and should have it for somebody with a disability to use it, if we see houses that only have steps in them, then we can talk to our community members, our community leaders about doing something about that. I was just thinking about a survey I participated in sometime within the last year or so about food access. And food access is things like, are you anywhere near a grocery store where you can get nutritious food? And if you're near such a grocery store, can you get into it? Do you have the transportation to get there if it's not within walking distance of wherever you live, or rolling distance? And are you stuck doing things like going to fast food restaurants, or really um, expensive local markets because you don't have access to appropriate food, to nutritious food? So I think the downside is that if you look at pretty much any part of society, that there's room for improvement. The upside, I can say, is that in the 40 years now that I've been doing this, there is there is improvement. And I have to talk a little bit about my passion, which is disability culture. So in the 80s, in the mid 80s, when I first began talking about disability culture, a lot of people didn't know what it was. That's not just people outside of the disability rights movement, but people with disabilities and in the disability rights movement as well. But today, disability culture is something that's part of many conferences, it's part of books, it's part of reviews of books. And the reason I'm linking it to the ADA is because one of the things I was going to say, used to say, but that's not true. I still say this, which is, if you don't understand your own culture, in this case, as a person with a disability, what is disability culture? Then how can you understand yourself? And to take this a little bit further, how can other people understand you? So if we don't understand, we as individuals with disabilities don't understand how disability impacts us, how can we impacts us as an individual, but not necessarily medically, culturally, socially, politically. If we don't understand that, how can we expect other people to do that and other people to respond to it. So that's why I'm really glad that many people are storytelling right now. I mean, we have this amazing time to be doing this, both for the 30th anniversary of the ADA, but also because so many of us are at home now, and we're on Zoom and other kinds of social media and talking about this and sharing our stories. And I wrote a poem many, many years ago now, literally 1991. I wrote this poem called Tell Your Story. It was the first poem I specifically wrote to be about disability culture. And my probably favorite stanza in it is, how will our children learn and compare if we don't dare to share? So that's, I think, the important thing that every individual can do, which is figure out a way to share our story. It could be, in a personal conversation. It could be on the internet. It could be lots of different ways. We have lots of different technologies now to do that.